The rope snapped the first time. On a cold morning in May 1701, a crowd gathered along the River Thames to watch a pirate die. Sailors stood shoulder to shoulder. Merchants craned their necks. Officials waited with stiff expressions. The man at the center of it all, Captain William Kidd, had once sailed with royal backing. Now he stood on the gallows, condemned as a criminal. When the trapdoor opened, the rope broke. For a brief, stunned second, the crowd gasped. Some whispered it was a sign, others called it bad luck, but the executioners simply reset the noose. The second rope held, and just like that, the British Empire believed it had ended the problem of Captain Kidd. But they hadn't, because what died that day was not the legend, it was the man. To understand how a respected privateer became one of America's most infamous pirate legends, we have to go back to a time when the Atlantic Ocean was the world's most dangerous highway, and loyalty was as fragile as a ship's mast in a storm. In the late 1600s, the American colonies were expanding fast. New York was growing into a vital trading port. Boston thrived with maritime commerce. Ships carried sugar, spices, textiles, silver. Wealth flowed across the ocean, and where wealth traveled, danger followed. Piracy wasn't just common, it was strategic. European powers, especially England and France, were locked in constant rivalry. Instead of sending only Navy warships to seize enemy cargo, the Crown issued something called a letter of marque. It was a legal document that turned a private ship captain into a licensed hunter. Capture enemy vessels, bring back the goods, and everyone profits. It was government-approved piracy, and William Kidd stepped directly into that world. Kidd wasn't some lawless drifter. He was respected in New York. He owned property. He had connections to influential merchants and political figures. When wealthy investors in London needed someone to command an expedition against French ships and known pirates in the Indian Ocean, Kidd seemed perfect. He was experienced, ambitious, trusted. The ship built for him was the Adventure Galley, armed with cannons, equipped with both sails and oars for speed, and crewed by men hungry for fortune. The mission was clear: hunt down enemies of England and return with captured treasure. When Kidd sailed out of New York Harbor, people saw opportunity, not criminality. But the ocean has a way of changing men. Months passed without major prizes. Enemy ships were scarce. Supplies ran thin. The crew grew restless. These weren't patient investors. They were sailors who had signed up for gold. They expected action. On long voyages, morale can rot faster than food in the hold. Whispers started below deck. Some questioned Kidd's leadership. Others suggested attacking ships that might not strictly qualify as enemies. The line between legal privateering and piracy began to blur, not on paper, but in desperation. Then came the Quedagh Merchant. It was a massive vessel loaded with valuable cargo, silks, sugar, precious goods worth a fortune. The ship was Armenian-owned, but carried French passes, documentation linking it to France, England's enemy. Technically, that mattered. Legally, it gave Kidd justification. Politically, it was explosive. Kidd seized the ship. To his crew, it was salvation. Finally, a prize worthy of the journey. But halfway across the world, in London, political winds were shifting. England was under pressure to prove it could control piracy. Diplomatic tensions were delicate, and powerful men who had financed Kidd's voyage were suddenly nervous. Because if the seizure of the Quedagh Merchant was interpreted as unlawful, their names would be dragged into controversy. So something subtle happened. Support faded. When word reached England, accusations formed quickly. Pamphlets labeled Kidd a pirate. Rumors spread that he had gone rogue. The same expedition once praised as patriotic began to look suspicious. And Kidd had no idea the ground beneath him was collapsing. He believed he had acted within his commission. He believed he could defend himself with documentation. So instead of vanishing into outlaw life, he made a bold decision. He returned toward American shores. That decision may have sealed his fate. When Kidd approached New York again, the harbor felt different. Colonial governors were under pressure from London to crack down on piracy. Public sentiment had shifted. the political climate was colder. Kidd tried to negotiate. He even buried part of his treasure on Gardiner's Island, hoping to use it as proof of good faith. It was a calculated move: show cooperation, secure protection, clear his name. But he underestimated how far the narrative had already turned against him. Authorities arrested him. From respected captain to chained prisoner, the transformation was swift. He was transporting first within the colonies, then across the Atlantic to London to stand trial. The journey back was not filled with triumph, but uncertainty. And here, where the story becomes less about piracy and more about power. Trials in early 18th century England were not like modern courts. Evidence could disappear. Political influence mattered. Kidd insisted that the French passes aboard the Quedagh merchant justified his actions, but critical documents were allegedly withheld from the court. He was not just fighting charges. He was fighting momentum. The government needed to make an example of someone. Piracy had become an embarrassment. Trade routes were vulnerable. Public outrage was growing. Hanging Kidd publicly sent a message: the crown controls the seas. Whether he deserved execution or not became secondary to the spectacle. When he was sentenced to death, the narrative was complete. Captain Kidd was officially a pirate. But here's the twist that would echo through American history. Not all of the treasure was recovered. And in a young, ambitious set of colonies, obsessed with opportunity, that detail mattered more than the verdict. Imagine being a farmer in Connecticut in the early 1700s, or a merchant in Boston, or a dockworker in New York. You hear that a man once trusted by the crown sailed these waters, buried gold along the coast, and was executed before he could retrieve it. That story doesn't die. It spreads. It grows. It transforms. Kidd's execution was meant to end piracy. Instead, it created one of America's earliest and most enduring treasure legends. People began searching coastlines. Rumors of hidden chests circulated. Maps, some fake, some convincing, appeared over time. The idea that wealth lay buried beneath American soil captured imaginations. And that idea was powerful in a land built on reinvention. Because America itself was, at that time, an experiment in possibility. People crossed oceans chasing opportunity. Kidd's buried treasure fit perfectly into that mindset. Maybe fortune wasn't across the sea. Maybe it was already here, waiting to be discovered. So was William Kidd truly a pirate? Or was he a politically convenient sacrifice whose death created a myth larger than his crimes? That's what we are going to uncover in this series. But before we go deeper into the mutiny tensions aboard the adventure galley, the financial breakdown of the captured cargo, and the treasure hunts that would last centuries, take a second right now. If you're fascinated by real American history, pirate legends, and stories where power and ambition collide, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to check the playlist for the next parts of this series, because this story only gets more intense from here. Because what happened on that ship wasn't just about gold. It was about pressure. It was about politics. And it was about how quickly a hero can become a villain when empires need someone to blame. And in the next chapter, we step back onto the deck of the adventure galley, where frustration boiled, loyalty cracked, and the line between privateer and pirate began to disappear. The wind did not change in a single moment. It shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly, like doubt creeping into a captain's mind at 3 in the morning. By the time the adventure galley reached the Indian Ocean, months had passed with little to show. The crew had endured disease, heat, spoiled food, and the endless psychological weight of open water. Investors in London imagined gold stacking neatly in cargo holds. Reality looked very different. The Indian Ocean was crowded, not just with ships, but with competing empires, private merchants, East India Company interests, and shifting alliances. Every vessel Kidd encountered carried political risk. A wrong decision could spark diplomatic fallout. And yet doing nothing was just as dangerous. Sailors had signed up for profit. They were not salaried Navy men loyal to flag and crown alone. They expected shares of captured prizes, The longer they sailed without seizing something valuable, the thinner discipline became. Life aboard the adventure galley was not romantic. It was cramped, loud, humid, and tense. Hammocks swung in tight quarters. Salt clung to skin. The smell of gunpowder mixed with sweat and damp wood. Arguments flared easily. Kidd had to balance authority with persuasion. Push too hard, and he risked mutiny. Push too little, and he risked losing control entirely. One incident reveals just how fragile command had become. A gunner named William Moore openly challenged Kidd's decisions. Moore reportedly urged the captain to attack a Dutch ship, a target that was not legally protected under Kidd's commission. Kidd refused. The argument escalated. In a moment of fury, Kidd struck Moore with a bucket. Moore later died from the injury. That single event would haunt Kidd. Was it murder? Was it a tragic accident born of pressure? In the courtroom years later, prosecutors would frame it as proof of brutality. But on a 17th century ship, under extreme strain, violence was not uncommon. Authority was enforced physically. Still, the death weakened Kidd's moral footing. Then came the moment that defined everything: the sighting of the Quedagh merchant. The ship was massive, heavy with cargo, valuable beyond comparison to anything they had seen in months. Silks from India, sugar, precious goods that could transform the voyage from failure to triumph. The legal question rested on documentation. The vessel sailed under French passes, papers indicating protection under France. England and France were enemies. That detail mattered deeply in maritime law of the era. Kidd believed, or at least argued, that this made the ship a legitimate prize. His crew did not hesitate. They seized it. The capture changed the atmosphere instantly. Morale surged. The hold filled with goods. For the first time in months, men felt rewarded. But triumph at sea does not guarantee safety on land. Unbeknownst to Kidd, political sentiment in London was shifting rapidly. Anti-piracy sentiment was rising. The English government faced criticism for failing to control privateering excesses. Investors tied to Kidd's mission were growing nervous. Because if the Quedagh merchant was interpreted as neutral rather than enemy, then Kidd's seizure crossed from privateering into piracy. And if that line had been crossed, those who funded him could be implicated. So distance became necessary. Letters moved quietly across desks in London. Support cooled. The narrative began to turn. Meanwhile, Kidd made another controversial decision. He renamed the Quedagh merchant and incorporated it into his fleet. The original adventure galley was deteriorating, worm-eaten, and leaking. The captured vessel became his primary ship. Strategically, it made sense. Optically, it looked like piracy. Here's the deeper tension that American audiences should understand. 17th century maritime law was complicated, inconsistent, and often manipulated. What counted as a lawful prize depended on alliances, paperwork, and political interpretation. In other words, legality was flexible. And flexibility becomes dangerous when politics intervene. Kidd sailed westward, believing he could justify his actions. He still saw himself as operating under authority, but rumors were traveling faster than his ship. Stories exaggerated his aggression. Some claimed he had attacked neutral ships indiscriminately. Others said he had gone rogue entirely. By the time he approached the Caribbean and later American waters, he was no longer just a privateer returning home. He was a suspect. Picture the contrast. When he first left New York, he was celebrated. Investors toasted his mission. Now, colonial governors received warnings from London. If Kidd arrived, he was to be detained. Kidd attempted one last strategic move before surrendering fully. He hid a portion of treasure on Gardiner's Island. This was not myth, it is documented. The buried goods were intended as leverage, a demonstration of cooperation. He likely believed this proved he was not a lawless pirate. But leverage only works when the other side wants negotiation. Governor Richard Coote, Earl of Bellamont, once associated with Kidd's backers, now faced immense pressure to show loyalty to the crown. Harboring a suspected pirate would be politically suicidal. So Kidd was arrested. The transformation was brutal in its speed. From captain commanding cannons to prisoner in irons, his men scattered. Some disappeared into anonymity, others blended into colonial life. And here, where something uniquely American begins to form. The colonies watched closely. They saw a man who had sailed under official commission, now branded criminal. They heard rumors that key documents supporting his defense were missing. They understood how distant political interests could reshape a narrative. That perception mattered, because early American identity was already sensitive to centralized power. The idea that a man could be elevated, used, and discarded by imperial politics planted subtle seeds of skepticism. Kidd was transporting to London for trial. The proceedings were swift and severe. Evidence that may have supported his defense, particularly the French passes, reportedly surfaced only after conviction. Was that coincidence or convenience? Historians still debate, but public execution left little room for nuance. When Kidd was hanged and his body displayed in chains along the Thames, the British government intended to send a message: piracy will not be tolerated. Instead, the colonies received a different message. The message was ambiguity. Because treasure rumors persisted. Not all cargo had been neatly inventoried. Not every sailor accounted for. Small amounts of wealth could easily disappear across ports from Madagascar to the Caribbean to Long Island. And once the idea of hidden treasure takes hold, it does not fade easily. Throughout the 18th century, treasure hunters scoured the New England coastline. Digging expeditions became common. Stories of cursed gold circulated. Parents warned children that Kidd's ghost guarded buried chests. The man executed as a criminal was reborn as a myth. But we need to pause here and consider something critical. Legends grow when gaps exist. If every piece of cargo had been transparently accounted for, if his trial had been universally seen as fair, if political backers had defended him openly, the story might have ended at the gallows. Instead, uncertainty fueled imagination. And imagination turned Captain Kidd into America's first great pirate mystery. Before we step into the next chapter, where we examine how treasure mania spread across New England and how writers like Washington Irving and later Edgar Allan Poe amplified pirate mythology in American culture, take a second. If you're enjoying this deep dive into early American history and the real story behind one of the most misunderstood figures of the Atlantic world, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And check the playlist for the next parts of this series, because what comes next reveals how a political execution transformed into a cultural obsession that lasted centuries. Because the most powerful thing Kidd left behind was not gold. It was doubt. And doubt in a growing America was more explosive than gunpowder. By the time Captain Kidd's body had stopped swinging over the Thames, something unexpected was already happening across the Atlantic. The British government believed it had closed the case. America was just beginning to open it. In the early 1700s, the colonies were not yet united, not yet revolutionary, not yet independent, but they were observant. They watched how power operated. They paid attention when narratives shifted. And in Kidd's story, many colonists saw something unsettling. A man who sailed with royal backing, financed by elites, suddenly branded a criminal when politics demanded it. That perception lingered. And perception, over time, becomes culture. Let's step away from the courtroom for a moment and look at what happened on American soil after Kidd's execution. Gardiner's Island, off the coast of Long Island, had already yielded buried treasure to authorities. That recovery was documented, chests of goods dug from the earth, catalogued, and shipped as evidence. But the existence of that buried cache confirmed something powerful. Kidd had hidden treasure once, which meant he could have hidden more. In a land filled with forests, rocky coastlines, and sparsely populated settlements, the idea that gold and silver might be buried beneath American ground was irresistible. Farmers who struggled through harsh winters imagined sudden wealth. Merchants dreamed of secret maps. Sailors whispered of moonlit landings and hurried burials. Treasure hunting became more than rumor, it became behavior. Throughout New England, excavation sites appeared. Men dug in fields, along riverbanks, near cliffs. Stories circulated of mysterious symbols carved into stones. Some claimed to have found fragments of chests. Others swore they saw strange lights in the woods, believed to be spirits guarding pirate gold. And this is where the legend begins to evolve beyond history. Because once superstition enters the narrative, facts lose control. By the mid-1700s, Kidd was no longer simply a convicted pirate. He was a ghostly figure in colonial folklore. Parents told children that digging at night would anger his spirit. Some believed treasure could only be unearthed under specific astrological conditions. Others insisted rituals were required to break curses. This wasn't just storytelling. It reflected something deeper about early American psychology. The colonies were places of uncertainty. Survival was not guaranteed. Crops failed. Trade fluctuated. Political authority was distant. In that environment, the idea of hidden treasure offered a form of hope, sudden transformation without reliance on imperial power. And that subtle shift matters, because Kidd's legend began to symbolize independence from authority. His buried gold wasn't controlled by London. It wasn't taxed. It wasn't regulated. It was free for whoever could find it. In a strange way, the myth aligned with emerging colonial attitudes. Now let's examine the financial reality behind the voyage. The Quedagh merchant carried cargo estimated to be worth the equivalent of millions in today's dollars. Textiles, sugar, precious goods, enormous value. But when historians compare recovered inventory lists to estimated cargo manifests, small discrepancies appear. Not massive gaps, but enough to sustain doubt. Crew members likely pocketed portions before surrender. Small bundles of goods could disappear easily across ports from Madagascar to the Caribbean. Corruption in documentation was not uncommon, and once goods entered informal markets, tracing them became impossible. So while there is no definitive proof of a massive hidden hoard, there is enough uncertainty to keep the possibility alive. And possibility is the engine of legend. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Kidd's name resurfaced again, this time in literature. American writers began shaping a national identity through storytelling. Folklore became cultural currency. Pirate imagery, buried chests, coded maps, haunted coastlines captured the imagination of readers hungry for uniquely American myths. Washington Irving's fascination with New York's past helped romanticize early colonial stories. Later, Edgar Allan Poe's The Gold Bug would center around hidden treasure, cryptic symbols, and coastal mystery, themes directly influenced by pirate legends like Kidd. Even if Kidd himself never buried a fortune beyond Gardiner's Island, his story created a template. The template was powerful: a morally ambiguous captain, a controversial trial, unrecovered treasure, a coastline filled with hiding places. That formula became embedded in American storytelling. But we need to go deeper, beyond treasure and into psychology. Why does Kidd's story endure in American culture more than countless other pirates? Because his identity is complicated. He wasn't born an outlaw, he wasn't universally despised. He was commissioned, funded, backed by elites, then abandoned. That arc mirrors a recurring American theme: the individual versus the system. Whether one views Kidd as guilty or wronged, his story fits into a larger narrative Americans have always wrestled with: what happens when institutions protect themselves at the expense of individuals? Was he reckless? Yes. Did he make questionable decisions? Absolutely. But was he uniquely evil compared to other privateers of his era? That remains debatable. And that gray area is exactly why his legend survived. Now let's shift perspective again, back to the deck of the adventure galley in its final months. The ship itself was deteriorating: worm-eaten planks, leaking seams, crew fatigue, Kidd's authority strained by long months without success. When he captured the Quedagh merchant and replaced his failing vessel, he made a practical decision. But practical decisions can appear incriminating when politics intervene. From London's vantage point, it looked like he had abandoned his commission and embraced piracy. From Kidd's vantage point, he was preserving his mission. History often depends on vantage point. By the time of his arrest in the colonies, Kidd likely believed he could defend himself. He expected legal reasoning to prevail. Instead, he became a symbol. And symbols are rarely treated gently. Public execution was meant to close the story. Instead, it amplified it. Centuries later, treasure hunters still reference Kidd. The Oak Island mystery in Nova Scotia, though never definitively linked to him, repeatedly invokes his name. Documentaries speculate. Books revisit his trial. Historians debate missing documents. That endurance is not accidental. It exists because the story contains tension that never fully resolves. Was he pirate or privateer? Was he criminal or scapegoat? Was there hidden treasure or just clever myth-making? The uncertainty itself keeps the legend alive. And here, where this becomes especially relevant for a modern American audience. America has always been fascinated by outsiders who challenge authority, even flawed ones. From frontier outlaws to rebellious entrepreneurs, the archetype of the rule-bender who collides with power runs deep. Kidd fits that archetype almost perfectly, not because he was noble, but because his fall feels complicated. Before we move into the next chapter, where we'll examine the political alliances behind his expedition, the investors who distanced themselves, and the larger global stakes at play between England, France, and the East India trade networks, take a moment. If you're enjoying this deep, cinematic exploration of real history and the myths that shaped America's identity, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to check the playlist for the next parts of this series, because the political forces behind Kidd's rise and fall are even more dramatic than the treasure legend itself. Because in part 4, we're not digging in sand, we're digging into power. And that's where the real mystery begins. By the early 1690s, the Atlantic world wasn't just a network of trade routes. It was a battlefield disguised as commerce. England and France were locked in conflict. Spain was weakening. The Dutch guarded their shipping lanes fiercely. The Indian Ocean had become a high-stakes chessboard where empires, corporations, and independent captains all competed for wealth. And in the middle of that tension stood something new, something modern. Private investment. Captain William Kidd's voyage wasn't simply a government mission. It was backed by powerful political figures and wealthy investors. Men with titles, men with influence, men who had reputations to protect. This is where the story shifts from treasure to strategy. Kidd's expedition was financed in part by prominent English elites, including figures connected to Parliament and colonial administration. The idea was brilliant on paper. Send a private expedition to hunt pirates and seize enemy ships, split the profits, and strengthen England's position without direct naval expense. Low risk, high reward. But ventures like this carry a hidden danger. If the mission succeeds, investors celebrate. If it fails or becomes controversial, investors distance themselves. And that's exactly what happened. When Kidd captured the Quedagh merchant, the legality hinged on technicalities, specifically the French passes aboard the vessel. Maritime law at the time was complex and politically sensitive. The East India Company, an enormously powerful corporate entity, was furious about disruptions to trade routes. Diplomacy in the Indian Ocean region was delicate. Suddenly, what looked like a profitable seizure began to look like a diplomatic liability. And liability spreads upward. If Kidd's actions were judged unlawful, the men who funded him could be accused of enabling piracy. That risk was unacceptable. So the narrative had to change. Instead of a commissioned privateer making tough calls in ambiguous waters, Kidd became a rogue captain who exceeded his authority. Notice how subtle that shift is. The facts didn't dramatically change. The framing did. When Kidd returned toward American shores believing he could defend himself, he underestimated the speed at which political protection evaporates. Governors in the colonies, including those previously friendly to him, were now under instruction from London to demonstrate zero tolerance for piracy. The empire needed to make an example, and Kidd was available. His trial in London in 1701 revealed more about political theatre than simple justice. He faced charges of piracy and the murder of William Moore. He argued that the French passes justified his seizure of the Quedagh merchant. Those documents, crucial to his defense, were allegedly not presented during the trial. Only later did they resurface. That detail is one of the most debated aspects of the case. Was it incompetence, or was it deliberate omission? Because if the jury had seen clear evidence supporting Kidd's claim of legality, conviction might have been harder to secure. But the government needed certainty. At the time, England's credibility as a maritime power was under scrutiny. Piracy threatened trade stability. International partners questioned England's ability to control private captains. A public execution restored confidence. In modern terms, Kidd's death was reputation management at an imperial scale. And American colonists noticed. They observed how quickly a man backed by elites could be discarded. They saw how documentation could disappear. They watched political self-preservation override nuance. These observations did not spark immediate rebellion, but they contributed to a growing skepticism toward distant authority. Now let's zoom out further. The late 1600s and early 1700s marked the rise of corporate power through entities like the East India Company. Trade wasn't just national, it was multinational, profit-driven, and politically entangled. Decisions made in London boardrooms affected sailors thousands of miles away. Kidd operated inside that system. But when tension escalated between commerce and diplomacy, individuals like him were expendable. That's the harsh truth. Privateering itself was always a morally flexible profession. Governments outsourced violence to private captains. When it was convenient, they called them heroes. When it became inconvenient, they called them pirates. The line was never fixed. Kidd simply became the most visible example of that instability. After his execution, his body was tarred and displayed in chains along the Thames, a warning to others. It remained there for years, a decaying message to sailors passing into London. But here's the irony. While London displayed his corpse to end piracy, America transformed his story into folklore. Because in the colonies, distance creates reinterpretation. Without daily proximity to British political pressures, Americans saw a different angle. They saw a man who had powerful backers, then lost them. They saw a trial with questionable fairness. They saw treasure not fully accounted for. That combination creates myth, and myth is stronger than deterrence. As decades passed, Kidd's story merged with America's growing identity as a place of opportunity and skepticism towards centralized power. Treasure hunters searched coastlines, writers romanticized pirates. The ambiguity of his guilt made him more interesting than clear-cut villains. He became something uniquely American, a flawed figure caught between ambition and authority. But we're not finished yet, because in Part 5, we're going to examine something even more fascinating: the economic aftermath. What happened to the wealth seized from the Quedagh merchant? Who profited? How did insurance markets, trade networks, and political alliances adjust after the scandal? And how did Kidd's case influence future anti-piracy laws across the Atlantic? Before we step into that economic fallout, take a moment. If you're appreciating how this story connects global politics, early capitalism, and the origins of American skepticism toward power, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And check the playlist for the next parts of this series, because the financial consequences of Kidd's trial reveal just how high the stakes truly were. Because in the end, this wasn't just about one captain. It was about an empire protecting its image. And empires rarely hesitate when image is on the line. When Captain Kidd was executed, most people assumed the story had ended. But in reality, the financial story was just beginning. Because whenever a ship worth a fortune is seized, condemned, auctioned, and absorbed into global trade networks, someone profits. The question is, who? After Kidd's arrest, the cargo of the Quedagh merchant didn't simply vanish. Goods were catalogued, evaluated, and eventually sold. Textiles, sugar, spices, and luxury commodities flowed back into European markets. Auctions generated revenue, legal fees were paid, administrative costs were covered. And the crown took its share. That's the first, uncomfortable truth. Even when piracy was condemned publicly, the economic machine kept moving. Confiscated goods didn't get destroyed as moral statements. They were monetized. In fact, one of the driving motivations behind anti-piracy crackdowns was not purely ethical, it was economic stability. Piracy disrupted predictable trade. Insurance rates increased. Investors hesitated. Merchant confidence wavered. Kidd's case became an opportunity for the British government to send a signal to global markets. Trade would be protected. Order would be restored. But restoring order requires visible enforcement. And enforcement can be profitable. When seized goods were auctioned, funds helped offset losses and demonstrate control. Insurance markets adjusted premiums, merchants recalculated risk, trade routes were reinforced with greater naval oversight. Kidd's execution wasn't just punishment, it was a market correction. Now consider this from an American colonial perspective. The colonies depended heavily on maritime commerce. Ports like New York and Boston thrived on Atlantic trade. When piracy spiked, colonial merchants suffered. But when the crown intervened aggressively, colonists sometimes felt the squeeze of stricter regulations and tighter oversight. That tension was subtle but significant, because increased enforcement meant more inspections, more illegal scrutiny, more direct involvement from London. In other words, Kidd's case contributed to expanding imperial supervision of colonial trade. And every expansion of control plants seeds of resentment. Over the next decades, Britain passed stronger anti-piracy laws. Admiralty courts expanded authority. Trials could occur without traditional jury protections in some cases. Efficiency replaced deliberation. From London's viewpoint, this was necessary modernization. From the colonies' viewpoint, it sometimes felt like overreach. And that matters, because long before the American Revolution, friction over trade regulation was building quietly. Kidd's scandal played a small but meaningful role in that shift. Now let's follow the money more closely. The East India Company had enormous influence at the time. Trade in the Indian Ocean was not just profitable, it was strategic. When ships like the Quedagh merchant were captured, diplomatic relationships strained. Merchants demanded accountability. Investors demanded reassurance. Kidd became the example that allowed Britain to reassure international partners. Look, the government could say, we punish unauthorized aggression. But notice the irony again. Kidd had originally been commissioned to attack enemy ships. The same flexibility that allowed privateering to function also made it volatile. Once political winds changed, financial alliances realigned quickly. And this is where the psychological dimension deepens. For sailors in the early 1700s, privateering looked like upward mobility. Risk your life, capture a prize, split the profits. It was one of the few ways ordinary men could leap economically. But Kidd's fate exposed the instability of that dream. If a captain with powerful investors could end up hanging in chains, what protection did an ordinary sailor have? That realization didn't eliminate piracy, but it reshaped it. In the years following Kidd's execution, piracy in the Atlantic didn't disappear, it evolved. The so-called Golden Age of Piracy actually intensified in the early 1700s, producing figures like Blackbeard and Charles Vane. Why? Because harsh enforcement sometimes radicalizes the very system it tries to control. When privateering became politically risky, some captains abandoned the illusion of legality altogether. If they could be labeled pirates regardless, why operate cautiously? That unintended consequence is one of history's recurring patterns. Crackdowns can stabilize markets. They can also harden opposition. Now return to America's coastline. Treasure hunting surged not only because of folklore, but because of economics. The colonies were still developing. Wealth disparities were sharp. The possibility of discovering buried goods, even small quantities, represented liberation from debt, dependence, or hardship. Kids' rumored treasure became symbolic of independent wealth outside imperial systems. And symbols influence culture. By the mid-1700s, pirate imagery entered tavern stories, ballads, pamphlets, and eventually literature. The financial scandal transformed into mythic narrative. The complexity of maritime law faded. What remained was the image: a captain, gold, betrayal. And images travel faster than nuance. But here's something historians emphasize. There is no verified evidence of a massive undiscovered kid treasure beyond what was documented on Gardiner's Island. Yet people kept digging. Why? Because the absence of proof is not the absence of possibility. And possibility fuels economies of its own: book sales, expeditions, local tourism, folklore traditions. Even centuries later, treasure hunting enterprises reference kid to generate intrigue. Oak Island theories, hidden coastal caches, lost chests buried under colonial farms. The legend itself became economically productive. Think about that. The actual cargo was finite. The story became infinite. Now we arrive at a turning point. In Part 6, we're going to examine the legacy. Not just the folklore, but the long-term cultural imprint. How kids' story influenced American ideas about rebellion, authority, ambition, and risk. How pirate mythology shaped entertainment, literature, and even modern pop culture. And why, more than 300 years later, we're still debating his guilt. Before we step into that final chapter, pause with me for a moment. If you've made it this far, you're clearly fascinated by how one man's rise and fall rippled through global trade, imperial politics, and American identity. So make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And check the playlist for the final part of this series, because the conclusion pulls everything together, from execution dock to enduring legend. Because Captain Kidd didn't just leave behind disputed cargo. He left behind a question that America still wrestles with. When does ambition become crime? And who decides? By the time the 18th century gave way to the 19th, Captain Kidd was no longer a man. He was an idea. The execution dock on the Thames had done its job in Britain. Officials demonstrated power. Trade stabilized. The East India Company moved forward. Insurance markets recalibrated. The empire carried on. But across the Atlantic, something very different had taken root. In America, Kidd's story detached from its courtroom origins and fused with something deeper: identity. Because the United States, once it emerged as an independent nation, built much of its cultural mythology around tension with authority. Revolution itself had been justified by arguments about overreach, distant power, and economic control. When Americans looked backward at colonial history, figures like Kidd felt strangely familiar. Not necessarily innocent, but not simple either. That complexity is what kept him alive in memory. During the 1800s, as American literature began defining national character, pirate imagery became romanticized. The sea represented freedom, ships symbolized autonomy, buried treasure suggested opportunity hidden beyond institutional reach. Even when writers didn't mention Kidd directly, the blueprint of his legend was present: the morally ambiguous captain, the coded maps, the coastline mystery. By the time popular adventure fiction exploded in the 19th century, pirates were no longer just criminals. They were anti-heroes, outsiders navigating rigid systems, men operating by their own rules. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because America resonated with the narrative arc. A man backed by elites, a mission tied to profit and power, a controversial decision, political abandonment, public punishment, lingering doubt. That structure mirrors countless American stories in business, politics, and culture. But let's return to the core question one last time. Was Captain Kidd truly guilty of piracy? The historical record suggests he operated in legal gray zones. He captured ships under questionable circumstances. He struck a crew member who later died. He made aggressive choices under pressure. At the same time, documentation supporting his defense appears to have been mishandled. Political backers withdrew strategically. His trial occurred during a period when the British government needed a visible anti-piracy stance. Both realities can exist simultaneously. He may have crossed lines, and he may have been sacrificed. History often refuses to give us clean answers, and that refusal is precisely why the story endures. Now consider the treasure legend itself. To this day, no verified massive hoard attributed to Kidd has surfaced beyond what was historically documented. Yet search efforts continue. Coastal folklore persists. Documentaries speculate. Amateur historians propose theories. Because the treasure isn't just about gold. It's about unfinished business. The idea that something valuable remains hidden just out of reach is irresistible. It mirrors the American belief in discovery, reinvention, and sudden breakthrough. In a way, the legend of Kidd's treasure aligns perfectly with the broader American dream, fortune waiting for those bold enough to seek it. But there's an even deeper layer. Kidd's story forces us to confront the unstable boundary between legality and power. Privateering itself was state-sanctioned aggression. Governments outsourced violence for profit. The same action could be heroic or criminal depending on diplomatic context. That lesson remains relevant today. Systems create incentives. Individuals respond to those incentives. And when outcomes become inconvenient, responsibility shifts. Kidd's fall illustrates how quickly support evaporates when optics change. He left New York celebrated. He returned in chains. That transformation is not just maritime history, it's human history. Ambition without protection is dangerous. Power without accountability is unpredictable. And narratives are often shaped by those who survive politically, not those who stand trial. By the early 20th century, pirate mythology had fully embedded itself into American pop culture. From novels to films to theme parks, the romanticized pirate became iconic, adventurous, rebellious, independent. Yet beneath the costumes and dramatization lies the echo of real events, of ships like the Adventure Galley, of trade routes in the Indian Ocean, of investors calculating risk in London, of a gallows overlooking the Thames. Captain Kidd sits at the intersection of those worlds. Not the most violent pirate, not the richest, not the most successful, but perhaps the most symbolically powerful, because his story exposes the machinery behind empire, how economics, politics, and perception intertwine. And here we are, more than 3 centuries later, still debating him. That alone says something. It says the legend accomplished what the execution tried to prevent. It survived. Before we close this journey completely, take a moment to reflect on what made this story compelling. It wasn't just buried treasure. It wasn't just a dramatic trial. It was the collision between individual ambition and institutional power played out on a global stage. If you've enjoyed this full deep dive series into one of early America's most enduring legends, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And check the playlist for more historical stories where myth and reality collide, because the past is far more complex than the versions we're usually told. Captain Kidd's rope broke once before it held. Maybe that's symbolic. For a brief second, history hesitated. And in that hesitation, a legend was born. The man fell. The myth didn't. And somewhere along a rocky stretch of coastline, in the imagination of every generation that followed, The sound of a shovel still strikes earth, just in case.